I'm Kelly Hancock, Public Programs Director at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia, but we also have a museum in Appomattox. Hopefully we've got some Appomattox viewers with us today as well. We've got a few programs, or just one program left for the year, and that will be our History Happy Hour that will take place in person on December 12th at Capitol Ale House. We'll have with us Bert Duckerly and Doug Crenshaw talking about their book, Embattled Capital, Richmond During the Civil War, just kind of highlighting a few aspects of what life was like in Richmond, the Confederate capital in the midst of the Civil War. So join us if you can in person for that event on December 12th. And then the first event that we have lined up for the new year, I don't have anything lined up for January, unfortunately, but our first event of 2023 will be our day-long symposium. And this event will take place on February 18th, and we will be live streaming it. Most of you know that our virtual events are free. In fact, a lot of programs that we do at the museum are free or free to members. The symposium is one of the few events during the year that we actually do charge for because it's a massive undertaking. But this year, the topic is the Civil War and Remaking America. And we'll be looking at the cause, course, and consequences of the war. Get a great slate of historians lined up for this event: Manissa Sinha, Andrew Lang, Aaron Sheehan Dean, Kate Mazer, and Carrie Janney will be joining us for this day-long symposium. And you can go to our website, acwm.org, to find out more about the symposium and register. And if you're a member, you should be getting our emails. We have a special code for members, a special discount. The event in person is only $50 for members. So check your emails for that member code. One other event that is lined up right now, actually our next, after the February symposium, our next book talk is on March 2nd. And we'll have Pat Brennan discussing Gettysburg in color. So you can mark your calendars for that. And I'm sure I'll be adding more as we go along. Now for tonight, I am pleased to introduce our two authors. We have Matthew Borders, who has an MS in Historic Preservation. He is a park ranger at Monocacy National Battlefield and is a member of Save Historic Antietam Foundation and the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. He is one of the 2019 recipients of the Save Historic Antietam Foundation's Dr. Joseph Harsh Award. And then we also have Joseph Stahl, who has an MBA and is retired from the Institute for Defense Analysis. He is a member of the Company of Military Historians, Save Historic Antietam Foundation, and Hagerstown Civil War Roundtable, and is the co-author of Identification Disc of Union Soldiers in the Civil War. And both Matt and Joseph are NPS certified battlefield guides at Antietam National Battlefield and at Harper's Ferry National Historical Park. Their first book together was Faces of Union Soldiers at Antietam. So you may have heard them here talking about that first book. And we are pleased to have them back tonight to talk about Union soldiers at Fredericksburg. So without any further ado, I'm going to unpin myself and turn the screen over to our guest.
Thank you, Kelly. And again, thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be back with y'all. And I'm going to do a quick share screen here and bring up the presentation for this evening. From the beginning, there we are. So everybody should be able to see this now, hopefully. If there's any issues, oh good, Kelly's giving me a thumbs up, so we're able to see this. This is, of course, the cover of our third work, Faces of Union Soldiers at Fredericksburg. And so we're going to be doing a dive tonight into some of the stories coming out of this book. This was 30 individuals that will fight at the pivotal late 1862 Battle of Fredericksburg. Look into the eyes of the soldiers and see the faces of those who dared to stare into the face of death was a quote that was actually said about the book by the chief historian of Fredericksburg National Military Park. We're very pleased to have had Frank O'Reilly take a look at our book and really kind of give it his blessing before it went out into the world. And so we wanted to include that here because these men really do, between Marye's Heights, which is what most folks are familiar with, and of course Slaughter Pen Farm, are really looking into the face of death when it comes into those Confederate defensive lines. There we go. So before we dive into the, oops, went too far. There we go. Sorry about that. Before we dive into the details this evening in regards to the soldiers themselves, we wanted to set the tone a little bit about what exactly is a carte de visite or visiting card. Joe, did you want to touch on this at all?
Oh, go ahead.
All righty. So these are paper images. They become extremely popular during the American Civil War. They had come out just before the Civil War. Now, they're going to be the most common form of photograph being done in the United States by 1860. And the prices range from anywhere from $2.50 to about $3 per dozen. So you bought these in groups at a time. And these images initially were of individuals, family, friends, that sort of thing. But as the war comes on, it becomes more about developing a memory or developing something that they could give and trade between comrades in arms, friends, or for the folks back home. There's also going to be something that Joe's pointed out a few times. Interestingly enough, they become almost like the trading cards of the day. And people begin to collect these images, not just of their loved ones or their loved ones' friends in their particular unit, but even famous individuals. Images of Lincoln, images of various generals become very popular, and even the generals of the opposing side. It's not uncommon to find CDVs with a back mark on it that says New York, but the image is Robert E. Lee or Jackson or something like that, because they were copying these images and selling them so prolifically throughout the United States. Now, one of the things that we wanted to point out, and something that we'll be seeing tonight, is this interesting stamp here we have here off to the left. This is a tax stamp, and it's one of the things that we use to help date the actual images, because the revenue stamps, as they were known, or these tax stamps, were really only used between August of 1864 to August of 1866. So that's a 2-year window. Now, you might be wondering, looking at this image, that appears to say August 1869 on it. It absolutely does say that. They were not using tax stamps by 1869, however, so we think this is actually a typo of sorts, that it should say 66. Now, by the 1880s, CDVs, which are basically just little 2x5 cards about yay big, actually, here's a good example. They're not very large at all, will be replaced by larger cards, and which become much more popular. Many of you may be familiar with the cabinet card. That really becomes popular by the 1880s, but we will see CDVs continuing into the early 20th century. But you guys are here to talk about the soldiers and to see some of their images, so we're going to dive right in. And the first gentleman we're going to be looking at tonight is First Sergeant William McCann. Lead off.
One of the things that we had to deal with is, and on the previous slide, we've identified the individual and given him, in most of our presentations, the rank that he had at the time of the battle. Unfortunately for us, we can't always find a photo with that rank. So for example, the individual you're looking at there, even though he's a first sergeant, at the time of the battle, he's obviously got shoulder stripes on and is some kind of an officer when this photo was taken. So we're always dealing with that the photos don't necessarily correspond exactly to the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg, for example. But this is a typical image. We call it a bust view. The information on the left, most of it comes from his compiled service records, which are available from the National Archives, kind of. Never mind, government bureaucracy. And what we do when we get a soldier is put in a request, go copy his service records. And what you'll find in there are bi-monthly reports that say he's present, he's wounded on such and such a date. There's a standard form if they get wounded. There's a standard form if they become a prisoner of war. And then you get muster in, muster out. And the other thing we sometimes find, if we're lucky, is what's called the company descriptive book page, which is detailed information about the individual himself. And you'll see examples of that later in this presentation. So this is McCann, and you can see he's at Fredericksburg. He'll be promoted to first lieutenant. He's commanding the company eventually. Muster out in Pittsburgh. Notice one of the common things we find in a typical soldier is he mustered out in June of 64, but he hadn't been paid since February of 64. Uncle Sam is not always super fast on their payments. And he fortunately received, excuse me, a brevet promotion, which is a temporary rank that you're allowed to have a uniform and do that if you're serving. And it's more a honorary thing done after the Civil War. So you can put a big title on your letterhead, shall we say. He lived, filed for a pension in 1890 and lived until 1914. And his body was taken back to Pennsylvania where it was buried. So this is the kind of information. Note he is wounded in action, but it couldn't be very, shall we say, major, because he's actually back with the unit by November, December time period. So probably went to a hospital for a while, got attended, and then came back. So other than that.
Yep. Let's, one of the other things that we did with these images was really do an analysis of what you're seeing. So for example, with First Sergeant McCann, as Joe pointed out, he's now an officer by the time this image is taken. He's actually a captain in this photograph, and this is a late war image for him. In fact, it may be at the end of his enlistment. We know this because he is this much higher rank. Joe had pointed out he'd been commanding the company for a while. He has signed this card, and of course, as we saw earlier, there is a stamp on it which has been struck out. This was a requirement by the photographers of the day. If there was a tax stamp, they were to strike it out with their name and ideally with the date the photo was taken. That is not always the case, but we generally are really glad to see those things. In this case, it's that weird one that it looks like it says 1869. And again, I'm pretty certain it's actually taken in 66. Now, as for the uniform itself, we do a detailed description in our book about what you're seeing in the uniform and what the various rank insignia means and that sort of thing, what it's telling us about when he is in his service. And we get into some of the regulations too. Why is he wearing his uniform this way? For example, McCann here, he has his frock coat on, which is the coat he's wearing on the outside, but it is entirely open. That's okay, because underneath that he has his vest. Now the vest there allows him to have his coat open in polite company, whereas a standard shirt like Joe or I would be wearing today would be considered an undergarment in the 1860s. And so to be in proper company and have your coat open, you still had to have something over that shirt. And McCann, excuse me, is also staying within regulations by he's got a little tiny cravat on. and officers were actually required to have a cravat. Now, he has taken a little bit of liberty with that because there's obviously some color there. It's kind of blending in a little bit with his high collar, but it was supposed to be just straight black for officers. But he's gotten a little bit of personality there, some obvious color in with that necktie. But let's take a look at our next soldier here. This is actually going to be Hiram Crawford. He's a first lieutenant in this photograph. He's actually a first lieutenant in this photograph, not only at the time of the fighting, and he's with the 20th Indiana Volunteers. You want to speak on Crawford?
He's a Canadian immigrant. Obviously moved south, joins the unit in 61 as a sergeant. And here's a regimental descriptive book. Tells us he was 5'7" 3/4" tall, dark complexion, black eyes, and black hair. Now, the other two things that sometimes are listed there is his occupation and where he was born. Notice down there that on his enlistment form, he says he was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, and worked for the railroad. But another form says he was born in Canada. So why is he fibbing? Who knows? He's present all the way until October of 1863. And then we got some notes on his service records that he was detached for recruiting duty. He was sent someplace not specified. He returns to the unit after he's been promoted, which is what he is in the photo. And eventually in May of 64, he will be detached and sent to brigade headquarters to be an assistant aide-de-camp. So he's assisting some general officer or the colonel of the brigade. He decided not to re-enlist, which was a big option in the spring of 64, when it first was allowed. And after the war, he got married, moved to Chicago, went back to working for the railroads, filed for a pension in 1900, and lived until 1920. He was one of those long-lived individuals. Then he's buried in Chicago, Illinois. This is the typical information that we find. There are several good sites that allow us to look for this kind of information. But as you can imagine, with names and spellings, sometimes we can't find someone.
Right. One of the things that we really strove to do for all of our works is try to find the final resting places of these men. And sometimes we're extremely successful. Find a Grave is a wonderful resource to use when doing that sort of thing. But sometimes these guys just disappear into the history and into the historic era, and we lose track of them. There's a couple of cases where we're pretty sure we know where folks are buried, but they're in a potter's field, things like that, where they're just unmarked. We'll know their relative location, but not an absolute final resting place. Now, in the case of Hiram Crawford here, he has been photographed when he is made a first lieutenant, and that's something that we also see quite a bit. Oftentimes, guys that are going into service as privates or as a lower rank will decide that, hey, once they get some rank on them, maybe some stripes on their sleeve, maybe some shoulder boards on their shoulders there, that now it's time to get a photograph. And a lot of these guys do once they make officer. Obviously, he's looking pretty proud of himself in this photograph. That dark hair and nice goatee and mustache are really prominent. But that's also something that we found was kind of amusing with the record, or not the records, excuse me, but with the rules and regulations of the day. There was no regulation for length of hair or style of wearing one's hair, not like in today's military where there's a lot of rules about that sort of thing. The only regulation in regards to hair, and especially facial hair during the Civil War, was that it be kept neat and trimmed. And Hiram has definitely done that here. Now, our next soldier that we wanted to take a look at is First Lieutenant Blanchard. And this is a fascinating image because he is put on basically everything. This is a full standing image obviously, but he's also got his full uniform on. Not just what he would have in the necessarily day to day, but this would have been going on to dress parade. Because not only is he got his very nice officer's frock, but you can also see he's wearing his sash, his sword belt. He has his sword there. He even is wearing his gauntlets, which is not something that we see a lot of for these images. So he's got his big gloves on, and of course he's wearing his kepi as well. Now, one of the things that we mentioned at the beginning of the talk here was that many of these images were being taken for folks back home as gifts or to share amongst their comrades in the service. They were also being utilized as calling cards, and that's what carte de visite actually means. The idea of having your name, your regiment, and usually your rank was something that was fairly common. And we see that here. He is actually signed with his full rank, name, and all that good stuff at the bottom of the image. And then on the back of it, we do have a photographer's information as well. So we have an idea where it came from. In this case, he was photographed in Boston.
Now, the other thing about this image is, you may not have noticed, but this image down at the bottom has that wide open space where he's written his name, rank, regiment, etc. That is a phenomenon from very early in the war. That tends to disappear, and borders were put on, and the double line that you saw in a couple of the previous images. So that helps us date this to a very early war. And of course, the photographer is in Boston. He's a Massachusetts man. So this was probably his full, I just got in, I just joined, I got all duded up. This is what I'm going to look like as an officer.
And so here's some details actually about him. Born in 1827, Clifton Blanchard was from Spearport, Maine. So he's not actually even from Massachusetts. Originally, he's from Maine. Now, he's a 35-year-old merchant living in Chelsea, Massachusetts when he enlists in Company C. And he would be joining the 35th Mass. And the 35th Massachusetts has a very impressive war record. Now, he's going to be present for 1862 when he joins up through June of 63. At that point, he is going to be detailed and would be an acting adjutant on December 14th of 62, and will actually have been in command of Company C for quite some time by this point. He will be promoted captain and transferred to Company B, which is actually what we're seeing in the image there. It even says Company B, 35th Mass. And he is going to resign in the middle of 1863 in June to return to his business. Now, interestingly enough, and something that we don't see very often, he will come back to the service in the same regiment. He would be recommissioned into the 35th Massachusetts on June 30th. So obviously his guys wanted him back, the war needed him back, and so he will go back into the service. And he would be wounded just over a year later at the terrible Battle of the Crater just outside of Petersburg. For those of you familiar with that fight or not familiar with that fight, that is, of course, when they explode the mine under Confederate lines, and then unfortunately, many Federal soldiers charge into that hole and can't get out again. Now, he is going to survive the war. He files for a pension, and unfortunately, we couldn't quite translate some of his records. A lot of these are still being handwritten, and we're not entirely certain what year he actually put in for his pension. We suspect it's 1869. And then his widow actually puts in for a survivor's pension in 1880, so she's obviously going to outlive him. He would pass away in 1879 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and of course we were able to find his burial location, Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. Did you have anything to add about 35th Mass?
The only thing to notice is he's joining them on August the 18th, 1862. And on September 17th, 1862, they're going to suffer a lot of casualties at the Battle of Antietam. They've been in the Army 4 weeks,
right,
and they're walking into combat. Imagine what those guys are thinking about. And from there, they're going to go to Fredericksburg.
Right.
Life was not good for them.
Like I said, a hard fighting unit for sure, and one that's going to have a heck of a combat career. A couple of things I wanted to point out in regards to the image itself. We're going to go back to the larger one for you guys to see that. Oops. If it'll let me.
Doesn't want to.
No, let me click on this real quick. There it goes. Sorry about that. There we go. So going back to the slightly larger view again, you can see that he is bracing slightly on the table, and just barely, I think you can just barely see a little bit of a brace sitting behind his legs there. What's happening is that there is actually a stand sitting behind his legs. It's one of the reasons why he's keeping his legs very close together, is to cover that as much as possible. And it's going up behind him, and there's a small V just behind his neck to keep his head as steady as possible. And I point this out because one of the great misunderstandings about Civil War photography is that we all tend to look at it and think, boy, they had to sit there for 3-5 minutes for an exposure. But come to find out, these could be done fairly quickly if the lighting, and it's all about the lighting. If the lighting is good, they only have to have that cap off that camera for a few seconds, and then they close it up again. In this case, the photographers still want you to be as still as possible, especially your head, so they can get the clearest image of your face. And so they would have things like a little table to brace against, or the base behind, or excuse me, the brace behind you to kind of hold your head in place, that sort of thing. Not because it was taking forever, but just they wanted to make sure absolutely that you'd be as still as possible and as clear as possible in the final image. Did you want to lead off with Houston?
Whoop.
There we go.
This is one of these things that is, we can't always resolve. That's a very interesting hat he's wearing. But even more interesting is, what is that little pin on his vest? We've tried blowing that up and we can't figure out what that is. It's obviously a pin of some kind. Is it a fraternal pin? Is it just a, who knows what? It's one of those kind of things that, you know, you keep going, what is that? What is that? But you can see, and that's the different style of hat, which is not that common. 6th New Hampshire is a well-done unit. They've been in combat for quite a bit before they go to Fredericksburg, where they're going to be, shall we say, shot up a bit. And he will muster out in 1865. Again, a stamp. Notice that this time, again, it's not dated. The photographer just drew a line through it. But it was taken back in New Hampshire, which leads us to think maybe this is a post-war or right after the war image, because he's the stamp and the fact that he mustered out in 65 from New Hampshire.
We also have a few examples of guys who are able to go home for various reasons over the course of the war. Either they're furloughed for a veteran's furlough. For example, the 6th New Hampshire, he's noted 6th New Hampshire veteran volunteers. So he might have had a veteran's furlough home. We do see that many of these photos being taken during that period, or because he is an officer and specifically a regimental quartermaster, which is what this is about. We can see the RQM there. He is actually potentially being sent on other duties as well. We did actually theorize as to what that pin on his chest could be in the book, and we'll touch on that a little bit here. Now, he's actually going to be born in, or was, excuse me, living in Plymouth, New Hampshire in the beginning of the war. He's 23 years old, having been born in 1837. And he joins up with the 6th New Hampshire in November of 1861. As we'd seen before, and as Joe had described with the company descriptive book, his details are listed in his records as well. He was 5'10", so he's actually a little tall for the average soldier, which was usually around 5'7", a light complexion, blue eyes, and light hair. Now, many of you may have served, and thank you for that, and you likely had your photo taken when you joined up. During the American Civil War, even though CDVs and photography was becoming much more common, they were not yet doing a photograph of enlistees. And so they would have these descriptive books instead to kind of describe what exactly this recruit looked like. Now, he would be detached to the quartermaster's department early in his career in November of 1861 and promoted to quartermaster sergeant and later quartermaster of the regiment. Actually, I believe that's a typo. It should say 62 there. My apologies. In September, October of 63, he has been made a first lieutenant without a date being given, so we're not entirely certain when he got that rank. And he musters out, as Joe said, in 65 in Alexandria, last having been paid in February. Now, he's going to return to Plymouth, and he has a brief career as an engineer. He's also an active member in the Masons. This is some of the additional information that we're able to piece together about these guys' lives, oftentimes by looking at their obituaries or their appearances in the newspapers. And he would be buried with full Masonic honors in the Trinity Churchyard Cemetery in Holderness, New Hampshire in 1872. And unfortunately, his death at the time was unexpected. Nobody saw that coming, and he was passed away unexpectedly at that point. Now, I'm going to do a little sneak peek, as it were, that we theorize in the book that the pin that Joe was talking about there on his chest is actually another ranking insignia for a first lieutenant. You'll notice the shoulder bar there has one bar on it, so he's a first lieutenant, and that bar on his chest may be a first lieutenant's rank. Okay, if he is in the quartermaster's department, it's very possible he has his coat off for a lot of work, but he still wants to have his rank insignia visible. It's possible that that's what that is. There is such a thing by 1863. We start seeing these, and they really come into vogue in 1864. They are called subdued ranks, where they don't have the great big shoulder boards, okay, with all of the gold embroidery. It's actually just a little bar in this case, or just a little eagle for colonels, or a little oak leaf for majors and lieutenant colonels. It's to make them blend in a little bit better with the men in the ranks, and so it's a little harder to pick out officers and things. Okay, so those subdued insignias begin to come in about mid to late 1863.
If you look back at the very first line, notice that he was a butcher before the Civil War. One wonders if that's why he so quickly got sent to the quartermaster department, because he was used to dealing with food supplies and things like that.
Yep.
Take advantage of what you did before the Civil as a civilian, if possible. So no way to prove that, but it makes sense.
Right. Yeah, it's a speculation on our part. So we've got a few other guys that we thought we would take a look at this evening. This is actually a fascinating individual and a little bit of privilege of rank going on here. This is First Lieutenant Frank French. Did you want to talk about Frank?
No, go ahead.
Very good. So this is a seated image, obviously, and the photographer is out of Vermont, Brattlesboro. A previous collector has put down a lot of information about Samuel French there. And what we're going to do is we're going to dive into some of his details, but something that I want you to notice is look at his leg there that we can see. Now, the officers that we've seen so far that have had these dark pants, most of them, or actually everyone we've seen so far, has been an infantry officer. Well, Frank French here, who would also go by Samuel, is actually an artillery officer. And so this seam, or this piping that we see along the seam of his slacks, was red. Something to keep in mind is that the Army, even up to this day, the Army is color-coded. Infantry was light or sky blue. The artillery was red. Cavalry is yellow. We do sometimes see green being utilized for the medical corps, occasionally for the engineers, but we also see yellow being used for engineers as well. And as another indicator, we do have a small crossed cannon badge there on the crown of his hat. But let's dive into some of the details on Frank here. He is actually the son of Brigadier General William French, who is a division commander in the Army of the Potomac, and he's born in Maine. His father commands a division at Fredericksburg, and Frank French is at Fredericksburg with the United States Artillery. Now, he is commissioned into the regular Army in the summer of 1861 as a second lieutenant, and he's assigned to Battery I, 1st United States Light Artillery. Now, we can't prove it, but Frank does not go to West Point. He goes from a civilian right into the Army with rank. Does his father have some influence on that? Possibly, but we can't prove that. Regardless, he does his duty. He is actually one of the few artillerymen, one of the few batteries to make it across the Potomac River during the Battle of Ball's Bluff, where he is severely wounded. And he would be promoted for that action in early 1862. He's going to fight through the Peninsula and Maryland campaigns before being made an assistant adjutant general to Lieutenant Colonel William Hayes during the Battle of Fredericksburg. So he's not actually manning a gun per se during the Battle of Fredericksburg. He's doing a lot of running around for Hayes. Hayes is commanding numerous guns during that fight and during the bombardment that occurred before it. And so he is going to have assistants such as his assistant adjutant general here running all over the place, sending orders, relaying messages, that sort of thing. So he's definitely on the field at Fredericksburg, just not necessarily in that traditional cannoneer role. Now he's going to serve through the rest of the war, by the end of which he has received 3 brevet promotions. Remember what Joe said, those brevet promotions are oftentimes come towards the end of the war. They are going to increase your prestige if you stay in the Army. They're going to allow you to potentially get a little bit higher of pay if you stay in the Army, especially when it comes to when you eventually retire. You'll be able to use your brevet rank for your retirement payments. In this case, he is going to be thrice breveted for fighting on the peninsula at Fair Oaks, fighting at Antietam, and then finally, much later in the war, Cold Harbor, 1864 action. These would all be dated to March 13th of 65, so real close to the end of the war. He is going to live in Washington, D.C. briefly, and we did find some evidence that he actually had a teaching gig on the side after the war and taught music and penmanship. There, we found some advertisements that he had put into the local papers about that. But unfortunately, his health was shattered by the war, not only through the wound that he had received at Ball's Bluff, but also the campaigning he did, and he dies of tuberculosis on September 4th, 1865, and is buried in Wilmington, Delaware. Did you want to add anything about Frank French?
No, the only thing is, notice again, one of the things you do see with his coat open, whether it's there's a chain there. Now, whether that's for a watch fob, key link, we can't tell, but that's not uncommon. We see that quite frequently especially on officers, that there'll be a chain or a band of some kind like that, obviously, for those kinds of things, keys and watches.
What we're also seeing with this photograph is not only is this a fairly relaxed pose with him kind of draped on the chair like that, but he's also not wearing a real formal coat. What he's actually wearing is what's known as an officer's fatigue blouse. You'll notice there's not a lot of ranking insignia on it. There's not a ton of buttons. It's basically a standard 4 to 5 button coat that you'd be wearing out in the field when doing work. And if he's moving around a lot of guns, working with the artillery, it's understandable why he wouldn't want a more formal coat on. And he's got something that's much more easy to use and be in. It also has pockets, unlike the more formal coats that don't have any external pockets. We can see a pocket here, another one on the breast. There would be a matching pocket on the other side.
And he's got a good mustache.
And a great mustache, yes. So this gentleman is a very interesting fellow because we actually have a non-traditional role. He is a hospital steward. Now, Barrows here, a seated image, but you'll notice, again, this is later in his career. He's been made a captain by this point. We can see the double bars on his shoulder straps. And he's also put ADC here at the bottom. So aide de camp. He's somebody's aide or somebody's assistant. And we're going to touch on who that is. Very thankfully for researchers like us, he has had his tax stamp struck out properly. There's actually a date on there for us to utilize. And this is interesting for Mrs. Webb, which is a hint as to who he's working for. But I'm going to switch it over here in just a moment. One other thing I wanted you guys to notice is this little pin on the top of his cap. He wants us to notice this. He's tilted his hat forward so that we can see that. The clover leaf, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that insignia. It is, of course, the corps badge of the Union's 2nd Corps.
And this is one of the more famous photographers with this very elaborate back mark, Alexander Gardner.
Why don't you take it away for William Barrows?
Born in 1842 in Ohio. He's a student before he enlists, musters into the field and staff as a hospital steward, as we alluded to earlier. He will be present through Fredericksburg. In the summer of '63, he's detached and sent on a service as aide de camp, 3rd Brigade, 2nd Division, 2nd Corps, who happens to be a general named Webb. Promoted to 1st Lieutenant. Still, now he's assigned to the 1st Brigade, detached again, and he's back to the Ambulance Corps as an officer. Promoted to captain and assigned to General Webb's staff in January of 1865 officially. So Mrs. Webb is probably the wife of his boss.
Right.
Mustered out on July 22nd, brevet promotion to major. He got to captain, went into manufacturing, worked for a number of places in Massachusetts. He went around quite a bit. Massachusetts, Illinois, and New Jersey as a mechanical engineer, and passed away in 1901 in Pennsylvania and was returned to Massachusetts. So he's one of those people that went around quite a bit. He was serving, if you look back, in the 19th Massachusetts, which was, again, one of those units that saw a lot of heavy combat between Antietam and Fredericksburg. They were shot up pretty badly. Got a nice little cravat there, you can see coming out over his collar there. And nice little mustache.
Yep. He's got a
Part in
little
his
mustache.
hair, just kind of relaxed a little bit. Very straightforward.
Another interesting element that we can see on this image of William Barrows is, again, he's not wearing a really heavily detailed officer's coat. He is actually wearing one of these officer's fatigue blouses, but he has these very distinct buttons on there. And he's an aide de camp, and so he is actually wearing staff buttons. One of the things that we try to delve into is all of the details on these uniforms and what are they telling us. In this case, he's got at least one staff button on. We can tell that from, where's my mouse? There it is. We can tell it from this kind of bulbous crown that it has on it with the very distinct ring. We also see that style of button with a number of state buttons, and we touch on those too as we find them. But we just got a couple of other guys we wanted to show you before the evening. And this is actually a gentleman with the 34th New York, Orrin Beach. Now, again, we've had a previous collector put a lot of information on the back of the card here. We may have something of a signature here. You can see Beach there in ink, and then the rest of it's been done in pencil. And they've put some pertinent details, where he's from, Little Falls, New York, where he musters out in Albany, his rank, that sort of thing. This sort of information can be great starting points or clues, but we always double, sometimes even triple check the information that's on the back of these that has been written by somebody else. In regards to the image itself, it's a wonderful standing view. Yes, he's been given one of these plinths to kind of brace himself on a little bit, but he is wearing a full frock coat, which he has open, and he does have his vest on underneath that. The light blue pants that he's wearing does have a blue piping going up the side, indicating an infantry officer. And then, of course, he is wearing his kepi with a laurel wreath crown with a 34 in the middle of it. A little unique. Oftentimes we see the hunter's horn or the French horn with the regimental number in the loop of that, but in this case, he actually has the laurel wreath for victory.
An older gentleman, 31 years old, when he enlisted, went in as a sergeant, maybe because he was older, and realized early in the war, sometimes they're elected to positions, so that would make sense. He's present until August 31st, 1862. In between, he's been promoted to second lieutenant, transferred to Company G. Here's one of these dates, February 17th, 1863, he requested 10-day leave, which was granted. So he went home to visit his family. The photo may have been taken at that point. Don't know for sure. Made first lieutenant and mustered out on June the 30th, 1863. The 34th New York is one of the early war units where they enlisted for only 2 years. So he's gone home. However, in January of 64, he had re-enlisted as a captain in the 16th New York Heavy Artillery. I guess the war was not going as well as he wanted, so he came back. And he will remain with them until August 21st, 1865. After the war, he's in the Independent Order of Odd Fellows and voted as he shot when it came to politics. Lived until 1905 and buried in the Bath National Cemetery in Bath, New York. So he's basically a New Yorker who stays a New Yorker.
Right. And we put that voted as he shot in there on purpose because when we dove into the background of these gentlemen, sometimes we'd even find things like their voting record. And he is in a number of articles out of New York about being a really staunch, hardcore Republican at this time. And that was one of the terms they used for drumming up support, was vote the way you shot. And he was a really big supporter of that, voting against Southern policies, voting against Democrats. He was going to vote the same way he shot in the war. So that's what that reference is, in case you're not familiar with it.
Okay.
Again, he's kind of taken a few liberties with his uniform. And he does have a striped cravat there, which is a little unique, but again, a fantastic image. He also has a small ring on his pinky finger. You might be able to make out there. It's very difficult to tell if that's actually a wedding band or not. There were no rules or traditions regarding wedding bands and where you would wear them at this point. So we do see rings kind of all over the board. Now, this is Ritter. This is a fantastic image. It's another artilleryman in this case, and it's one of these images that's been personalized. This is definitely a gift. We can see on the back here, he has written yours truly, McRitter, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, January 4th, 1864. So yes, we've got a date this was taken, or at least very close to where it was taken, and is a fantastic image of an artilleryman. The short jacket, usually for mounted troops, and that red piping. You can see there, it's just barely being able to be seen that it's that darker color. It would have been red in this case. Now, David Ritter is going to enlist as a private in Company K of the 126th Pennsylvania Infantry on August 7th, 1862, and was from Franklin County, Pennsylvania. Now, he is going to have a number of names. This was something that we found quite a bit with some of these guys. He is referred to in his records as Davis Ritter, David Ritter, excuse me, Davis M.F. Ritter, Davis McPherson Ritter, and Davis Mick Ritter. So it was interesting piecing his career together. But he does muster out in 1863 at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He had done 9 months of service with the 126th PA. And he's going to re-enlist in the United States Army, joining the 2nd Pennsylvania Veteran Heavy Artillery. That's what we have here. He's in his artilleryman's uniform. He's going to serve the rest of the war with the heavy artillery, and was apparently a part of a detail that fired one of the last shots of the war at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, which is the fighting that occurs on the morning of the surrender at Appomattox. A lot of folks don't realize there was fighting the day of the surrender of Lee's army. And according to the unit history for the 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery, they fired one of, if not the last shot of the fighting there. They would claim it's the last shot. I don't think we'll ever conclusively know, but they do claim to have fired
Lots
the
of
last
people
shot.
claim that.
Yes, lots of people claim that. He is going to apply for a pension in 1879, and his pension card shows that his wife and his child will receive a survivor's pension after his passing. Unfortunately, he's one of these guys who disappears from the record. We really were not able to find much about him. We have some suspicions as to where he might be today, where he was buried, but we weren't able to conclusively prove where he wound up. And so we didn't want to necessarily put too much speculation into the book. But again, another great image that we have here. And this is actually, I believe, the last guy we're going to be talking about tonight. Joe, you want to take it away with Jervis?
Oh, interesting uniform.
It's a workman's shirt.
Yes, he's not in uniform, and it's a little hard to read on this copy, but he didn't like this picture.
That's right.
He told the photographer he didn't approve of it. And as you can see, what's written on there is his name, EDES, and that he's born in 1834. We suspect this picture was taken just before he enlisted, and obviously he didn't like it.
Right. We've got some details about that, actually.
He's another person whose last name is spelled several different ways in the service records. 27 years old, mustered in as a private in Philadelphia. He was detached shortly after he mustered in as the brigade bugler, and he remained so until the summer of 1863. He re-enlisted in December of 63, and there was a note in his service that he got an advance of $13. $13 a month was the pay for a private. He was a painter before the war, and his descriptive re-enlistment form says he was 5'6" with blue eyes, brown hair, and fair complexion, and says he was a painter. Wounded in action at Spotsylvania Courthouse, gunshot wound to the upper 1/3 of his left arm. Company muster out roll shows that he was still in a hospital over a year later. After the war, he went back to his painter's trade, and for over 10 years ran a cigar store in Reading, Pennsylvania. Veteran Union Legion member, died in 1907 at age 72, and he's buried on the family plot in the cemetery in Reading, Pennsylvania.
So Eads is another fascinating character. Joe mentioned it, but the back of the car, or the back of the image, actually does say, when you put the contrast on so that you can read the pencil, it's the photographer asking him how he feels about this image, and he says, "I don't like it at all." So why they still saved it, we don't know, but apparently Jervis Eads was not a huge fan of having his picture taken. Now, we're going to open it up to you guys. We're just at about an hour now, so we're going to open it up to you all for any questions you might have. But again, this has been a presentation about our book, Faces of Union Soldiers at Fredericksburg. We have some additional works as well. Our original was Faces of Union Soldiers at Antietam, and then Joe and I took on the rest of the campaign with our second book, Faces of Union Soldiers at South Mountain and Harper's Ferry. But it has been our pleasure to speak with you this evening, and we look forward to any questions you might have. So let me do a stop share real quick, and we'll be able to see those all the easier.
Well, thank you both very much. as with last time, absolutely fascinating to hear about these different men.
And worked better this time too.
It did. We had no technology issues, which is excellent. Well, I know there were a lot of questions that came in, so I'm going to get to some of those. Nils asked, what sector of Fredericksburg did the 35th Massachusetts participate in? Was their regimental casualty rate particularly high in proportion to other Union regiments that were involved?
I'm glad you asked that, because we have an appendix at the back of the book that specifically lists out the casualties for each regiment, so that you can see that compared with others. The 35th Mass was actually part of the Union 9th Corps. Now, the 9th Corps is not one of those that we see heavily engaged at Fredericksburg, but they will be one of the commands that's thrown in. Joe's pulled up the details for me here. They're actually going to sustain 63 casualties at the Battle of Fredericksburg. They're not involved with the final assaults on the wall, particularly, unfortunately, the troops from Pennsylvania that are brand new and get thrown at the wall for the last time, they really get chewed up. But the 35th Mass is one of those earlier attacks that is trying to basically help extricate the Second Corps after it's gone in.
As to the size, just to give you a reference, before Antietam, they're a brand new regiment. They went into the Battle of Antietam with somewhere between 600 and 700 men and suffered more than 300 casualties. So if you take that and say, okay, if they were 700, they lost 300 plus. So they're probably down to between 300 and 400 men at Fredericksburg, and they're losing not quite a third of them
right
at Fredericksburg of what's left. So they suffered pretty much.
Yeah. And Jeff has a question, which it kind of goes along with suffering and losing men. He said, was the company descriptive book also used for body identification?
Oh, that's a great question, Jeff. I don't honestly know if that's the case. Joe has actually done extensive work on ID discs and the unofficial dog tags that were oftentimes purchased by these soldiers to help with ID. Joe, did you want to?
I doubt that because that would have been in the company records, and that would have been in a wagon, probably not necessarily accessible on the day of the couple days after the battlefield. However, I will say that it is pretty clear from many of the reports that regiments or companies even would attempt, after the fighting was over and the other side had moved away, to go back to where they fought to identify the bodies that they could find, because they knew who they were. Now, the problem with that, there's an account of a soldier by a sergeant in the 4th Rhode Island that after the Battle of the Crater, they couldn't get back to where they had fought for 3 days. And by the time they got back, he basically says the bodies, they couldn't tell who was who, except for one body where they found on it the ID disc of the guy. So in that case, they were able to identify him based on his ID disc. So it varies back, and it depends were the body's disturbed. Did somebody take their valuables, a watch, a pocket watch, maybe a presentation? So, so maybe they did, maybe they didn't.
And it's important to remember, and it's important to remember dog tags don't exist yet. They won't until the First World War. So there's no official ID that they would have been carrying on them by the Army. So those personally purchased ID discs or any sort of note they may have written and sometimes stitched into their coat or that sort of thing, that would have been the only sort of identification they would have had on them.
And Stephen has a question, or actually more of, I think, just a comment, that most of the men looked older than their years. And just noting that they're, probably in their 20s. Is this just because of living a harder life at the time, or
some of
the uniform that makes them look older?
Perhaps war is hell, for one thing. It does age people. We've seen this through all conflicts where we've had photography involved. in the case of a lot of these guys, it's funny that you mentioned that, Stephen, because I was just having a similar conversation earlier today with some of my colleagues. Civil War soldiers, they all tend to look like they're too young to be in the military, or they all look quite a bit older. But you're absolutely right. Most of these guys, the average age of a Civil War soldier for the Union is between 20 and 22 years old. Whereas for the Confederacy, because especially of the conscription processes they would have with pulling in some older folks, their average age is actually slightly older than federal troops, some usually between 22 and 24. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Most of these guys are in their 20s, and then a number of them, as we saw tonight, in their early 30s, but they definitely look older than that. Different type of living, and it, I think, has a lot to do with it as well.
If I would, and you may be getting a little bit of a slanted opinion here, because the images we showed, purely by what we picked, tended to be more so officers, and those tended to be a little older because they were elected at the beginning of the war, which means they're the banker in the town, the lawyer in the town, the school teacher. You know, we had one guy who was a butcher. So those people would have been, you would expect, a little older, maybe late 20s, early 30s, which is what we saw. If we had pulled all just images of privates, I suspect you'd have seen a lot more younger faces. Mm-hmm. And we do have some younger faces in the, I can hold this up. I don't know if you can see that very well, but that gentleman looks a lot younger there. And he's in the 19th Mass.
And Stephen also had a kind of a follow-up, just asking about where these men, or kind of when they typically got their pictures. Was it right after they enlisted and got their uniform? Was it before, after they had joined the service, or before they went into battle?
That's actually a really good question, because it varies so much. Many of these guys are getting images right before they're at their rendezvous point, they're at their training camp, that sort of thing. They've just gotten their gear, so now let's go get a picture taken. A lot of them are doing that. Many of them, though, are not having their photos taken, like we said, until they get some under their belt. Start seeing stripes or shoulder boards for officers. That's when we see a lot of photos being taken. There's a lot of photos out there of sergeants and lieutenants because of that, because they need a little bit of rank. Now it's time we look a little spiffy, so we're going to go get our photo taken.
And we're getting better pay.
And better pay, so they can afford.
That would make sense, yes.
The other thing is the availability of a photographer. I have a soldier taken, he's in a Vermont, based on what I can see from the image, it looks like it was probably taken in 1862. And it turns out the photographer is in a town. And I was able to confirm, looking at that was after the Battle of Am for about 2 weeks at on the edges of Hagerstown. So my supposition is, in that roughly 2 week period in October of 1862, because he's right there outside of the town, he'd get a pass, go into town. There was a photographer there. Hey, let me get my picture taken. Mm-hmm. So that availability of photography, there are several. 46 Pennsylvania is one. The regiment actually had a quote regimental photographer who brought his equipment into the regiment campsite and would take pictures. And so on the back it said, I can't remember the guy's name now, the photographer to the 46 Pennsylvania. So, and there's some variation of that where photographers would attempt to make an agreement with a regiment or a brigade corps to be allowed to the area to take pictures and make money, obviously.
Right. And then, Matt, as Joe
I think you might have jinxed us because everything was flowing very smoothly, but all of a sudden we got a lot of glitches, but hopefully that won't continue. The internet was a little sluggish there, so well, hopefully that will work. If it starts glitching out again, I might have you turn off your camera and just do voice for a little bit, but
Sure,
Hopefully, hopefully it was just a temporary thing. So
Right.
Karen has asked if a man's family received a survivor pension. She says, I would think you could find out where they died and where they were buried. Did they apply for military gravestones?
Military gravestones. That's a question. Nice. And in regards to pension index,
Uh-oh, Matt, you're
doesn't have
cutting
date
out.
of death. Okay, let me cut my.
Yeah, I think cut the video and see if that will help us. All right.
Is that any clearer, Kelly?
I think so, yes.
Okay,
Let's try and see.
great. Sorry about that. Percent is that those pension index records do not always have on them, nor they don't where he's buried or even where he died. You guys
Okay.
are still coming.
Yeah, you're cutting in and out, but hopefully, I think we just have maybe a couple more questions. So hopefully we can get through these last ones and people can hear. So Michelle says, Addison Mead, my great great grandfather fought at Fredericksburg. He was a carpenter from New Boston, New Hampshire, and was with Company C, the 11th New Hampshire Infantry. He mustered in September 1862 and out June 1865, joined up at the ripe old age of 30 with one small daughter and another baby on the way. After leaving service, he went home, fathered his only son, whom he named Grant Sheridan Mead. Oh, what a great name. He is in the Register
Wow.
of Soldiers and Sailors, War of the Rebellion, published in 1895. And she wants to know, where can we get their book? I think in reference to the Register of the New Hampshire Soldiers and Sailors, War of the Rebellion.
Okay. I would look for that book on what's called archive.org. That should be a domain book by this. Oh, it's not, Michelle. It's not. There, the physical copy of, if you wanted a PDF of, often you can find these public domain books online. Is that not the case with that one, Michelle? Oh, unmute, yeah, unmute yourself.
Let's see, I may have to give her permission to
Oh,
unmute.
okay, no problem.
Let me see. We can try that. Let me see. Well, let's see here. You'd think I would be able to do that. I think I'm gonna have to go back to my participants. Okay, give me 2 seconds. And,
No problem.
well,
There she goes.
Hi,
oh, good.
I have it.
Fantastic.
This is it. It's the register for all of the soldiers and sailors from New Hampshire. Published in Concord, New Hampshire in 1895.
Oh, so you do have the book.
I
I thought you
have
were
it.
asking about
No,
it.
I want to know how to get their book.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Well,
Well, we greatly appreciate the support.
and you can get their book, I'm sure, at multiple bookstores and online. You can also get it through the museum's bookstore. So you can visit our website at acwm.org and get the book. We have copies of it. Matt, do you want to, are there a few other places you can direct her to?
Yes, that's, you basically covered them, Kelly. We were breaking up a little bit there, but yes, most of your bookshops, you can either request it if they don't have it on the shelf. In regards to down closer to you guys, it should be in the Civil War section of most of your big book retailers, your Barnes and Noble, your Books A Million, things of that nature. Of course, you can always go through the American Museum, the Museum of the American Civil War, or you can reach out to us personally. We're happy to send books out to people as well. I'm gonna turn my video on real quick because I want to show you something. We actually do have a gentleman who is in the 11th New Hampshire. And so we do have
Angle it
some.
a little bit. There we go.
There you
Oh
go.
my
So we do
gosh.
have some stories and information about them as well. So definitely something to look into.
And I
It's in
have
our book.
buttons.
Nice. Very nice. Uniform buttons, fantastic. But,
Well, that's
so yes, thank you very much for your interest in that. It should be available most anywhere. And if you wanted to go the computer route, you can pull it off of Amazon.
well, thank
That
you. And
comes-
it's always fun to find those kind of personal connections, I think. And
Stuff.
one last question, Niels has asked about just kind of the reports that were written by the Union officers at Fredericksburg concerning the valor of the troops at the slaughter pen farm or Mary's Heights. Just kind of how were the reports written? Did they talk about the valor of these men in these terrible places of fighting, or?
Exactly. For the most part, yes. And what we did is that not everybody wrote a report. Most officers do, but not everybody does. We take chunks of their report that are specific to the fighting out and highlight those in the book. Sometimes we've been able to take whole reports out, but for this one, it was the big chunks that are related to the fighting that we're talking about at the time. The officers, they want to highlight what their men did, and they are talking about the valor of going into this gunfire, of pressing on under terrible conditions and against very heavy odds. Many of them are talking about how close they got, be it how close they got to the wall, showing that they stuck with it until they just could not go any further. Many of them at Slaughter Pen Farm are talking about that breaching the Confederate lines, capturing large swaths of Confederate troops, but then not being supported. There was no follow-up to exploit the breach, and they had to withdraw eventually, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of this really highlighting the valor in the moment. So for example here, this comes from the officers of the 48th Pennsylvania. Too much praise cannot be given to all the soldiers and the following officers who were in the battle: Colonel Pleasance, Major Wren, Adjutant McGinnis, Captains Bast, Gowan, Winlock, Hoskins, Beauchamp, Gilmore, Porter, Brennan, and Lieutenants Boyer, Eveland, who we actually write about, Wood, Humes, Lucer, Bohannon, Fisher, and the list goes on, for their gallantry during the entire engagement. Their line was steady and unbroken while advancing under the most murderous shelling of the enemy, and their fire deliberate, well aimed, and effective. So again, they are trying to promote their actions during the fight. They're trying to really show the valor of their men under fire. Kelly, we did have a question. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
About the cost of the photograph. Did you just see that one? Yes.
Yes,
I
I
saw
did.
that pop up too. So why don't you talk about that a little bit? I think you mentioned it at the beginning, but
Yep.
refresh our mind.
We did touch on it a little bit at the beginning, and these photographs, though we made the joke about getting rank and getting a little bit more money so that you could afford them, they were fairly cheap, especially by modern standards, usually between $2.50 and $3 a dozen, because when these photos were taken, they were often taken with 4 photographs at a time, because there would many times be multiple lenses in these cameras. These big box cameras, they'd take the cap off of the lens, but it's exposing 4 images in there. And so that's why if you get a number of the same image of a gentleman, of a soldier, sometimes they'll be just slightly different angles. Okay, that's because of how it was photographed. So these were actually fairly cheap. It's why they're so popular, and it's why we see folks getting images of more than just their loved ones or their buddies. They're actually collecting these. Go ahead, Joe.
I have an image in my collection of Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, Command Second Corps, Gettysburg, one of the more
Famous.
well-known, famous generals. And written on the back of it, the person who bought it wrote that they bought it on January 31st, 1865, and it cost them 25 cents.
Mhm.
So there's an example.
Right.
So that was where they walked into a shop in downtown Washington, DC, and looked at a case with images in it and said, oh, I'll take that one. And it was 25 cents.
So fairly cheap, even by the standards of the day. They were very affordable. But as we were commenting on during the introduction, while we will see CDVs continue into the early 20th century, they are basically superseded by about 1880 by larger format images. The cabinet card becomes very popular at that time.
Basically 5x7.
Yeah, a 5x7 image as opposed to the 2x3.
Well, thank you, Matt and Joe, so much for joining us tonight. I know you've only got the room at the library until 8 o'clock. So we're going to get you out of there on time. I want to thank everyone for tuning in this evening, and definitely get the book, get their other book, so you can learn more about these soldiers. And as we mentioned, the book is available through the museum's gift shop. And if you're a member, you get a discount. So if you're not a member of the museum, certainly think about becoming one. It's a way to support the museum and the programming that we do, and the collection that we have and that we are continuing to enlarge. So thank you all for joining us. And again, special thank you to Matt and Joe. And everyone have a wonderful holiday season.